Hello again. So this evening I'm going to be looking at this beer, which is my version of the 5 Points Best Bitter, and very nice it's looking too. But I thought I'd also take the opportunity to have a little chat about a few tips that I think are really important for making a really good English bitter. So let's get into the beer and let's get into how you go about brewing really good bitters. So first of all, this beer, you may well have heard of it before, because this is the recipe that the Craft Beer channel did a version of based on information they got from the brewery, 5 Points Brewery, and they got a kit made up with Maltmiller, and quite a few people I know who watch this channel have probably brewed this already, and loads of you were raving about it. Quite a few people I know quite well were raving about it, so I thought I'd have to give it a go myself too. And it's really nice. It's got a lot of Fuggles in it. Fuggles is not a hop that I would automatically sort of be my go-to, but in this beer it works really well, and it's just a really good kind of classic English bitter, but with a bit more oomph on the hopping front, shall we say. So let's have a little look at the recipe and we'll talk about that. If you want to see the original videos from the Craft Beer channel, I'll put a link to those. There's all the background on the beer from 5 Points Brewery and some more information on the recipe, but I will go through that. It is available on the Maltmiller as a kit as well, as I mentioned, so get over there if you want to take the hassle out of putting the recipe together. So in this beer you've got my version, which is a 20 litre batch, and it works out to 3.4 kilograms of your pale ale malt, 150 grams of amber malt, 150 grams of crystal malt. I went for a medium crystal malt in this, and 150 grams of wheat malt. So a fairly straightforward malt bill, but there's a few things in there that I want to talk about in a bit. And then on the hopping front, as I said, there's quite a hefty amount of hops in this, especially when you compare it to traditional bitter recipes. And it's all Fuggles. So we've got 40 grams of Fuggles at 60 minutes. We've got 30 grams of Fuggles at 15 minutes, and then 80 grams of Fuggles at flame out or whirlpool. In this case, I think I whirlpooled it for 20 minutes at 80 degrees C. So the beer itself, aroma wise, it smells like classic English pub ale, and earthy, slightly floral, a few fruity hints of maybe kind of hedgerow fruit in there. There's definitely some sweet caramel malt on there, a bit of biscuity, bready notes from the base malt, a little bit of spiciness maybe. But overall, it's just really what I would associate, all of the aroma that I'd associate with a classic English bitter, really. And appearance-wise, a nice light kind of coppery colour to it, sort of amber, dark honey kind of colour. It is clear now. The yeast that is in this, which is the White Labs WLP13, does not want to drop out particularly easy, I've found. This beer is served off of the hand pull via a keg with a floating dip tube in it, so it shouldn't take that long to be getting clear pints out of it, but it took me a long time with this one. Certainly a number of weeks, if not months, before this was actually pouring, well, anything like this. I mean, it's not 100% crystal clear, but it's certainly clear enough by my standards at this point. So it does hold a reasonable head on it, but obviously with it being pulled off of the beer engine, once the carbonation's knocked out of it, it doesn't tend to sort of generate any more bubbles, but it has got lovely lacing on the glass, as you can see, and a nice appearance all round, I thought. Flavour wise, definitely an earthy, slightly spicy, slightly floral. There's a lot of what you would imagine you'd get from a beer that's quite heavily hopped with Fuggles, but it's also maybe a bit more complex than that. So there is a little bit of dark fruit, maybe a little bit of plumminess in there in the background, perhaps even a touch of marmalade, kind of slight orangey citrusness to it. Not a lot. It is mainly that kind of earthy, sort of spicy floral flavour, but there's a lot of hops up front with this, which, as I said, with the amount of hops going in, you'd expect. That said, the maltiness is still there. There's quite a woody character to it as well. So this yeast is described as having quite an oaky ester to it, and I can definitely see that in this beer. I think when you combine the earthiness of the Fuggles hops with the kind of slightly oaky character from the yeast, it's almost like gives it a character as if it has been not aged on wood, but maybe like if it was served in a traditional wooden cask, it perhaps tastes almost like it's been served like that. There's a good firm bitterness to it. It's very refreshing and drinkable. So to me, overall, it just drinks like a really nice, classic English bitter, but with a bit more oomph from the hops. And it really kind of pushes, I guess, the boundaries of what you'd expect from using something like Fuggles in that kind of quantity. So I really like it. And I think it's a great base recipe maybe to experiment with more. So I tried at BrewCon the Maltmiller's version of this that they used Centennial in, which was absolutely stunning. And as much as I like this beer, I would definitely like to try doing it with those hops as well. So yeah, a good recipe to try different hop varieties out in for an English bitter as well. Anyway, so I mentioned talking about tips for making a good best bitter. And I think there's a lot of things that we can pick out from this recipe which basically meet those criteria. So let's start off with the base malt. And in my case, I used some Warminster base malt, their pale ale malt. And normally I would say maybe avoid a run-of-the-mill pale ale malt, but the Warminster pale ale malt is actually kilned slightly darker, so it's about 7 EBC, I think. And that's the kind of colour range that I think you're looking for in your base malt, which would cover things like the classic choice of Maris Otter and a few of those other varieties which are traditionally used for bitters to give you that kind of biscuity, bready, maybe slightly nutty flavour that you might not get with a slightly lower colour pale ale malt, which will sit back a little bit in terms of flavour. So, as I said, Maris Otter is an obvious choice. Depending on which maltster you're getting it from, you're going to get a lot of variation in flavour potentially there as well. I've mentioned Warminster, I think they're fantastic. You've also got a few producers offering heritage malts now as well, so things like Chevalier, which are definitely going to be worth experimenting with. So yeah, essentially go for some of those more traditional British pale ale malt varieties, which are slightly darker in colour. We're only talking about, you know, sort of up towards 7-8 EBC rather than anything dark as such, but it will make a difference in terms of that flavour that you're building everything else on top of. So carrying on with the theme of the malt bill, this recipe only uses a single type of caramel malt, and I think most bitter recipes you're going to see some use of caramel malts in, although there are a few classics that will just have a base malt and maybe a touch of really dark roasted malt in there for colour. But you'll see it in the majority of recipes, I guess, the use of caramel malts. There's nothing wrong with using a single caramel malt, but just from my personal experience, one thing that you can do to really enhance the flavour from those is maybe use a little bit of a blend of different types. So if you want the dark, slightly burnt toffee flavours of the dark crystal, but then a little bit of the sweeter caramel notes of a lighter crystal malt, split the caramel malt addition between them and try and layer those flavours up a little bit. I found that works really well for me in a few recipes that I've done, and I've had good feedback on that from a few other people that have tried it as well. So caramel malts, kind of a given that they're going to be in most recipes, but maybe try experimenting with layering up some different types in terms of colour and obviously the flavours that they give you as well. This recipe also features amber malt, so I think that the use of speciality malts, particularly the lower colour roasted malts or roasted speciality malts, so not caramel malts, but things like amber malt, biscuit malt, aromatic malt, maybe brown malt as well. That's getting a little bit towards the darker end of the spectrum for me in terms of that category. These are fantastic malts for adding a little bit of extra character into your grain bill. And if you like a beer with a little bit more complexity to the malt flavour, so bringing in a little bit of maybe a coffee note or a slightly more deeper kind of biscuity or bready flavour, kind of bread crust type taste to it, then these are really good malts to bring that without bringing the additional sweetness that you're going to get with caramel malt. So amber malt is great. That would be my go-to for bitter recipes, but biscuit malt, really good. I've not used aromatic malt myself, but it is quite similar to those malts. So you'll get slightly different character from those different types, but they're all in a fairly similar kind of range colour-wise, and it might be worth trying out those different ones. But certainly amber and biscuit malt are two that I've used. So in this recipe, there's about 4% amber malt, and I think I would say kind of like 5%, 5% as a starting point for those specialty malts is a great place to go. As I said, just to add a little bit more depth of flavour in the malt bill. And you can go beyond that. So a friend from the podcast, Chris, in his persistently bitter recipe, which I'll post a link to in the description, goes a little bit more full on with the amber malt. You may find that your beer needs a little bit longer to condition when you do use those specialty malts a bit more heavily. But from all reports of people that have brewed it, and quite a few people have brewed that recipe, it works really well and gives an incredible depth of flavour to that beer. So 4 or 5% a great starting point. Don't be afraid to maybe push the percentage up a little bit if you want to see what character those specialty malts can bring to the party. So quite a bit on the different malts there. Want to now talk about the yeast, which I think is really, really important for English bitters. You could argue that it's actually a style which is to some extent driven by the yeast, because a lot of English bitter recipes are actually really pretty similar. So any of you who've got the Graham Hughes real ale recipe books, I've forgotten what the proper name for that, Brew Your Own Real Ales, I think it's called. If you've ever had a flick through that, you'll have seen that most of the recipes are very, very close together. And one of the things that always slightly annoyed me about that book was the fact that it didn't really make that much of a comment on the yeast varieties that you should. In fact, it didn't suggest the yeast variety for any of those. Now, granted, the book was probably published at the point where the selection of yeast available was very limited, but nowadays we do not have that problem at all. And I don't want to come out and say dry yeast will not produce a good beer, because of course it can. You can produce fantastic beers with dry yeast. There's probably been many, many competition winning beers, many very successful commercial beers which have been brewed with standard dry yeast varieties like SO4 and Nottingham. That's not the point. My point is there's a huge variety of different yeasts that can produce different flavors in the beer, and some of my favorite beers have come from trying out different yeasts in these sort of recipes. So this beer is an example that uses London Ale WLP13, and I mentioned earlier the kind of interesting oaky or woody esters that brings to the beer, which are quite unique, I think. Other personal favourites for me, so the West Yorkshire yeast, so Y Yeast 1469, which is supposed to be the Timothy Taylor strain, is fantastic. Quite a fruity one, quite a bit of sort of stone fruit and kind of pear-like flavours in that one, if I remember rightly. Again, not something you're going to get with a lot of the sort of standard go-to strains that are available, particularly in dry format. The Fuller's yeast, there's lots of liquid versions of that available as well. Yeah, there's so many. I mean, that's the thing. Like I said, I think you could argue that bitter or English ales are a kind of yeast-driven style, because there's so many different house yeasts around from all the various breweries that have, been around historically, and they're all lending a slightly different flavour profile to those regional beers, which makes them distinct despite a fairly similar recipe in a lot of cases that they're actually brewing to. So I'm not saying you have to use liquid yeast. I'm not saying that dry yeast will not produce a decent beer, but try out different strains and see which one gives you the result that you're looking for. Perhaps maybe you want a more fruity outcome from the yeast than what you get with the standard option that's suggested in a lot of recipes. So let's talk about bitterness quickly. So the style is called bitter, and I think that kind of tells you what what my next suggestion is going to be. Don't be afraid to give it a fairly firm bitterness. So the bitterness in this beer is important for the drinkability and to make you want to come back for another sip once you've had a little bit. And I think the bitterness should be fairly firm. For me, this recipe, I think the IBUs come out about 37, but more importantly, the Bugu ratio on that works out to about 0.85, which is kind of bang on where I would sort of want most of my beers in this style to sit. For me, somewhere between 0.8, 0.9 on the bitterness units to gravity units ratio would be perfect for my taste. You might want it a little bit gentler than that, but I would say if you're going anywhere below 0.7, we're starting to get a little bit too sweet in terms of balance there, and perhaps it's venturing more into the territory of maybe milds or brown ales when you get to that point. So don't be afraid of the IBUs for this style. Go for that kind of Bugu ratio between sort of 0.8 to 0.9 if you like a fairly firm bitterness, but don't drop it too low, even if you do want it to be a little bit gentler on the bitterness front. So that's bitterness. Last thing, serving. I mentioned already that this was served off of a hand pull, and for me, like having a beer engine, obviously the gold standard for serving up a bitter, but it's not realistic that everyone's going to be able to do that. So what are the alternatives if you can't do it that way? I'm not going to get into the whole argument over whether it has to be from a cask, by the way. Mine's out of a keg, which is fed on a very low pressure system to the beer engine. But what are the alternatives to a cask or a keg fed hand pull? For me, if you want an actual kind of authentic pour, the much maligned pressure barrel is actually a really good option. So yes, they are a pain in the arse and they leak and they're quite bulky and difficult to store or whatever, but they work for producing basically a similar sort of effect to what you get with a beer engine, which is kind of knocking out most of the carbonation as you pour it, and giving you a fairly nice sort of pour if you've got the carbonation right. Similar to that, mini kegs I always found worked quite well for traditional English ale styles for the same reason. And if you are just going to use them in a standard keg with a tap, just make sure that you keep that carbonation level fairly low on there. So you definitely want to be under 2 volumes of CO2, and I would suggest you're probably going to be more towards 1.6 volumes, 1.7. I think the thing with carbonation is it's easy to push it up. It's not so easy to knock it out. So start low, and if you feel like it needs a little bit more life in it, crank it up a little bit afterwards. But lower carbonation, if you can serve it off of a beer engine, obviously pressure barrels and mini kegs work quite nicely to get a similar sort of effect for me. And the other key thing is the temperature as well. I mentioned, did I mention before? Anyway, I'm not sure, but this is a little bit colder than I'd like it because it's February at the minute and it's actually freezing in the garage. 10 to 12 degrees for me is a nice solid temperature. Some people will have it a little bit warmer than that, but somewhere between, I guess, 10 and 14 degrees is for me a good temperature for serving ales like this, so that you actually can taste that kind of malt character and any of the other more subtle things from the yeast and so on. So, yeah, that's it. I think that's everything that I wanted to say about brewing and serving bitters. So if you've got any points that you think are worth adding to that, or anything that you want to ask questions about, please feel free to jump in the comments and have a little discussion about that. Or if you think I'm talking bollocks about any of those things, do feel free to let me know politely if you want to, and we can have a little discussion about that as well. So yeah, that was 5 points best bitter and a little bit of a discussion about brewing these sorts of beers. Cheers.
I'm the dude. So that's what you call me, you know? That or his dudeness or duder or, you know, El Duderino if you're not into the whole brevity thing.